we give the floor to you, Reid, and we would like to thank you very much for accepting our invitation to give a talk to our French Beatbox Day. So hopefully you managed to follow a little bit of our talks in French, but we're looking forward to your development on phonology harmony in Beatbox.
Merci. And merci tout le monde for inviting me, and félicitations to Dr. Paroni. Thank you for letting me be a part of this day. I'm so very happy to be here. I will try to speak simply, and it's against my nature, but briefly, as while I talk about my dissertation work a little. Just to confirm, can you hear me okay?
Perfectly, yes. Okay. Yes.
Okay. Très bien. I'm working on 6 years of high school French, so please forgive me when I try. I come to beatboxing with a linguistics background. The types of questions that I'm interested in are, what are the cognitive units of language, from the big to the small? Often, what are the smallest cognitive units of language or of speech? And are those units domain specific? Is language domain specific, or is language continuous with music and other types of actions and behaviors that humans have? How unique is language, and how unique are our cognitive units to language? And likewise, what's the relationship between speech and other types of behaviors? How do speech and music interact with each other, or speech and beatboxing, perhaps? And what are good ways to model these things? What are good ways to think about them from a theoretical cognitive science perspective? So these types of questions inform how I think about beatboxing science. And so I ask questions about what are the cognitive units of beatboxing. I'm very grateful to people in attendance today for having coined the term boxeme. It's been very helpful. So thinking about what is a boxeme, or what are the components of a boxeme. What types of phonological patterns exist in beatboxing, if any? Does beatboxing have much of a phonology, a set of regular sound patterns that are highly predictable? And if so, what is the nature of those sound patterns? What is the relationship of beatboxing to speech? And is it possible for beatboxing and speech to interact? And if so, do they do that in a lawful, ordered sort of way, or are the interactions random? And what are the applications of beatboxing to, or beatboxing science rather, to beatboxing art, beatboxing therapy? And there were so many wonderful presentations today that I couldn't understand completely, but I'm looking forward to going back and watching the YouTube videos very slowly to learn everything everyone said. So today I was invited to speak about my dissertation, which had a few different components, including a study of phonological contrast between beatboxing sounds, how beatboxing sounds differ from each other, based on MRI work that I did with an undergraduate colleague of mine, Nimisha Patil, who is a US beatboxer and who is responsible for collecting our MRI data. Another chapter on predictable sound patterns in beatboxing, whether they exist and what their nature is. On phonological harmony, which is a particular kind of predictable sound pattern, which I'll talk about more today. And also the integration of beatboxing with speech in the art form called beat rhyming in US English. And I did this with an undergraduate colleague named Ramita Fulsambad, who helped to find and annotate and analyze the data. Today, I'm just going to focus on two aspects of this: the predictable sound patterns, one of the predictable sound patterns, and how that built into phonological harmony. I'm very grateful to Dr. Paroni for having spoken as much as she did about the power kick and the humming kick, which I'll be calling by different names. So I'll be able to breeze through a few things here a little bit more quickly than I do with other audiences. I want to first show us some examples of lingual airstream, which sometimes is called velaric airstream, glottalic airstream, and pulmonic airstream in the MRI data that we have, as I think it will be helpful going forward. Many of you are familiar with these kinds of things, but it's still, I think, nice to see. So first, this is what in US beatboxing is sometimes called a spit snare, a voiceless lingual egressive bilabial affricate in this case. And it's produced by full tongue body closure against the velum, a full labial closure. And I'm calling it lingual egressive, but there's, I'm sure, other buccal squeezing and other things going on to express the air. But the focus for today is on the tongue. So the tongue moves a little bit forward as the jaw moves up to squeeze the air out through the lips. The MRI videos have poor sound quality because of the noisy reconstruction, the noise of the MRI, and the difficulty in extracting that noise, the sound from the noise. So these don't sound good. But here's what this spit snare looks and sounds like. We also have a kick drum, a voiceless glottalic egressive bilabial stop. In this case, the larynx, which is represented by a little dot. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse cursor, but this little dot will raise up and down, and we'll see a complete lip closure and a release of that lip closure as the kick drum is produced. So that's an example of a glottalic airstream. And for pulmonic airstream, we have the inward K snare, a voiceless pulmonic ingressive velar affricate with a lateral palatal release. So the tongue body makes a closure, and as it releases its closure forward and laterally, the air is brought into the lungs. Okay, with those examples out of the way, let's talk about a predictable sound pattern that I looked at. So for a language example in US English, in many cases, a vowel becomes a nasalized vowel when it precedes a nasal consonant. So in the case of the word pan, it's thought that the underlying vowel is a, but that because it precedes an alveolar nasal n, then it's nasalized to pan. So if I work in articulatory phonology, which uses gestures as the fundamental units of speech, so I'm going to represent this in a gestural type of layout. So in gestures, we would say that pan is represented by bilabial closure for the lips to create the P sound, a palatal constriction of the tongue body for the a, and then two gestures, one a velum lowering gesture and the other an alveolar closure gesture to make the n sound. And it's important that the velum lowering and the alveolar closure are not temporally synchronous with each other. The velum lowering regularly in American English starts earlier than the alveolar closure does. And so we end up with temporal overlap between the vowel constriction and the velum lowering, creating a nasalized vowel. I wondered if something like that might also be happening in beatboxing. So we have the force kick drum or power kick versus an unforced kick drum or humming kick, which I'm indicating with a capital and lowercase b. They're both created with bilabial closure in the vocal tract, but whereas the force kick drum is made with laryngeal closure and raising, the unforced kick drum doesn't have any of that. The larynx is often inert, the vocal folds are spread wide apart. On the other hand, the force kick drum is made without a tongue body closure against the velum, whereas the unforced kick drum has a tongue body closure. And this is the MRI example of the last few examples that Dr. Paroni was given between the power kick and the humming kick, where for the unforced kick drum, we see the tongue body making a closure against the velum. In the MRI, they look like this by comparison. And the unforced kick. Okay, now they're both kick drums, and metrically in terms of their function in beatboxing and their distribution in beatboxing utterances. These two sounds pattern very similarly. And so if we in linguistics are interested in describing by, say, phonological rules, how one sound changes to another in a certain environment, it seems plausible that there might be some rule we could define for characterizing how a forced kick drum becomes an unforced kick drum, how a power kick becomes a humming kick. So I used data from just one expert beatboxer in this case, who made 52 different beat patterns, a total of 141 unforced kick drums and 330 forced kick drums that I annotated and transcribed and looked at. For this little analysis, I looked specifically for whether the kick drums were between two tongue body closures. So if there's a forced kick drum with another sound that had a tongue body closure on the left and another tongue body closure on the right, near just one tongue body closure, either on the left or on the right, where the sound on the other side was did not have a tongue body closure. And for cases where the kick drums were surrounded by no tongue body closures, with the interest of trying to see if the unforced kick drum or the forced kick drum are predictable, since the tongue body closure is an important aspect of their characterization. Maybe just like with the vowel nasalization example, maybe there's some kind of temporal overlap that's causing perhaps the unforced kick drum to adopt a tongue body closure when it's close to another sound. So I looked for kick drums, encoded them by their proximity to other sounds with tongue body closures. And I did the same for the cases of the unforced kick drum too. And the top row which is coded as yellow, where the kick drums are between two tongue body closures, is, in my opinion, the important color to look for. The forced kick drum only occurred 5% of the time between two tongue body closures. In the majority of cases where it was found in my data set, there were no tongue body closures on either side of the kick drum, of the forced kick drum. And in about a third of the cases, it was on the left or the right of a tongue body closure sound. But very rarely did a forced kick, a power kick, appear between two sounds with tongue body closures, despite it not having a tongue body closure of its own. On the other hand, the unforced kick drum appeared almost always between two tongue body closure sounds. When the cases where it did not appear between two tongue body closure sounds, the most of the time, there was a sound with a tongue body closure on its left or on its right. It only rarely occurred with no tongue body closure nearby. So this seems like a predictable environment. Just as in US English, we can say that a vowel becomes nasalized before a nasal consonant. In beatboxing, we could say that a power kick becomes a humming kick when it's between two tongue body closures. So much for a predictable sound pattern. What does this have to do with phonological harmony, which is what the title of my talk promised I'd talk about? Well, harmony in language, I'm using an example from a language called Tuyuka, happens when you have a sound that spreads some aspect of its nature forward or backward through a word as far as it can in the cases I'm talking about. So in this case, the bilabial nasal here spreads its nasality, and in doing so creates the Tuyuka word for badger. This word can be represented gesturally with a bilabial closure gesture and a velum lowering gesture for the M, a palatal tongue body constriction for the first E vowel, a bilabial closure and a spread glottis gesture for the P, and another palatal constriction vowel. The important part here is that in order to get the harmony to go, in order for the bilabial closure in order for the M to spread its velum lowering gesture, the velum lowering has to extend temporally as far as it can throughout the entire word. And when a gesture does this, I code it with a couple yellow bars on it. So this is a gesture that is doing a lot of spreading here. So we see these kinds of examples in many languages where a gesture, a cognitive speech unit associated with some particular sound spreads throughout an entire word or for a far distance. And since we see these examples in speech, we might wonder if we see something similar in beatboxing as well. And it turns out that we do. So this is an example of a pattern that was produced by the beatboxer I was studying, who was intending to produce a pattern that highlighted the spit snare, the lingual egressive sound that we saw before. In this example, I'm going to zoom in on the right on the tongue body and the velum. Right now, the tongue body and the velum are apart. This is at the beginning of the video, and you can tell because there is a dark space between the tongue body and the velum representing air. But once the video gets going, the tongue body and the velum are going to meet and stay met. They don't come apart at all during the course of the video, which tells us that there's a tongue body closure that's staying active throughout the entire utterance. Here's what that looks like. I'll show that one more time. I hope that was clear. We can talk about it more if it wasn't. So if we see this kind of spreading, which we might call a harmony in beatboxing, just like we saw it in Tuyuka, what would that look like for beatboxing? We could imagine our kick drums again with bilabial closures and laryngeal closure and raising gestures, and then take, say, the spit snare, which is a sound that comes with a tongue body closure already because it's a lingual sound, and that lingual sound, that tongue body closure can spread throughout the beat pattern. We can annotate that with some more of those yellow bars, and when it does, the laryngeal closure and raising of the two kick drums disappears because, as we recall, the force kick drum, the power kick, had the laryngeal closure and raising, but many of the unforced kicks do not. Okay, so that's what we might call a beatboxing harmony pattern, at least at a surface level description. Now, many of you may be thinking, now Reed, this is just an example of a humming beatboxing pattern. Of course, when you have a tongue body closure, it stays active for a long time because in a humming beatboxing pattern, you need to separate the oral chamber from the pharynx and the nasal passages in order to get the melody and the percussion, just as Dr. Paroni was saying. And sometimes that's true, except that in a lot of cases in my data set, there's no humming at all in these cases where there's a tongue body closure. And the tongue body closure goes up and stays throughout the entire beat pattern. So we might think that it's the humming that's causing the tongue body closure to start and to stay active in order to create the melody. But that might not actually be the case. It's certainly not in the beat patterns I have that don't have any humming at all. Which suggests that we should be looking elsewhere for the cause of the tongue body making its closure and staying where it is when it doesn't necessarily need to in these kinds of patterns. And separately, if from a linguistics perspective, if we're going to analyze this pattern as a phonological harmony pattern, akin to what we would do in a language example, then it's important to try to identify natural classes of sounds that participate in the harmony in different ways. So all this to say, we revisit the three different airstreams, lingual airstream, glottalic airstream, and pulmonic airstream, to see how they participate in the harmony pattern differently. So in the example that we saw before, the case of the spit snare example, I've underlined all the sounds in the beat pattern now at the bottom, all of the sounds that are made with a tongue body closure that are lingual sounds by default. And there's only one sound that is a lingual sound by default, and that's the spit snare. All the other sounds, I've used some annotation here, but essentially there's humming kicks and humming hi-hats, unforced hi-hats, and other variants of things. All of the other sounds in this pattern, except for the spit snare, are never produced by the beatboxer in my data set on their own, and are never produced outside of humming or tongue body closure harmony context. So this suggests that the spit snare may have something to do with causing the tongue-body closure harmony to occur. And in fact, the spit snare is not the only sound that does this. There are, in my data set, this beatboxer produced 7 different sounds that are lingual sounds by default, underlyingly, we could say. And each of those 7 sounds is produced exclusively and always in a tongue-body harmony type of beat pattern. So these include the click roll, which I'll direct special attention to. This is a sound where you would get a tongue-body closure against the velum, an alveolar closure of the tongue tip, and then the tongue body pushes forward to squeeze air past the tongue tip to create an alveolar trill. There's also sounds that my beatboxer called a clop, duck or meow sound effect, a lip roll, a spit snare, which we've seen, and then 2 variants of a water drop sound. So here's the click roll. It went fast. It's again, look for the tongue body pushing forward to make an alveolar trill. There's also the clop, the duck meow sound effect. All these sounds are made with tongue body contact against the velum, the lip roll, the spit snare, and the 2 water drop variants. And again, in all of these cases, all these sounds are always and only used in beat patterns where there is this tongue-body harmony. And they're often the only sounds that are underlyingly made with a tongue-body closure. And so we can say that lingual airstream sounds are what are actually responsible for causing tongue-body closures to extend throughout a beatboxing utterance here. What about the other 2 kinds of airstreams? Do they exhibit patterns as well? We already saw that a forced kick drum becomes an unforced kick drum when it's between 2 tongue-body closures. And it turns out that it's not the only case. Many of the glottalic sounds that we find in these kinds of patterns also turn into tongue-body closure sounds instead of glottalic airstream sounds. So they adopt a lingual airstream or sort of no airstream. So we can say that glottalic airstream sounds always undergo the beatboxing harmony, and lingual airstream sounds are the ones that trigger it, that cause it to go in the first place. Pulmonic airstream, I will not talk about for very long. It's complicated and there's not as many examples as I would like. But in my data set, I argue that pulmonic airstream sounds stop harmony in its tracks when they show up. So if we take a beat pattern like this one, which has a forced kick drum with a bilabial closure and laryngeal closure and raising, the click roll that we talked about, which has an alveolar closure as well as a tongue body closure, and this one is a harmony inducing tongue body closure, so it's spread as far as it can. Another kick drum and an inward case snare, which has a tongue body closure and lung expansion. The tongue body closure of the click roll causes the kick drum, the first kick drum's laryngeal closure and raising to disappear, but it doesn't get a chance to stop the closure and raising of the second kick drum because instead the lung expansion gesture prevents, there's a blocking of the tongue body closure. And if this is something that's interesting to you, I will send you this chapter of my dissertation and you can decide for yourself whether you think it's a good story or not. But in any case, I would say that pulmonic airstream sounds in this data set tend to pattern in the same way with this blocking kind of behavior. All right, so to wrap up here, this is just a section of my dissertation, but in terms of my thinking about the contribution to beatboxing science here, we can ask about what are the cognitive units of beatboxing again, and I find that phonological gestures are very helpful for thinking about beatboxing as the smallest unit of beatboxing sounds, smaller perhaps than a boxeme or composing themselves into a boxeme. What types of phonological patterns are there in beatboxing, if any? I would argue that there are phonological alternations and harmony, just like we find in speech, which is very exciting because this tells us that beatboxing may have some intrinsic deep down relationship to speech, a shared foundation for similar phonological principles and behaviors. And that's very exciting from a cognitive science standpoint because it tells us that language might not be as unique as we thought, that maybe some of the underlying units, the fundamental units of language may in fact be shared across different domains outside of language too. And it's also very helpful for thinking about applications to therapeutic interventions. If we know how beatboxing and speech are related cognitively, underlyingly, and in this case, analytically, it may help us to create different types of beatboxing-based therapies that are informed by that relationship between beatboxing and speech, which is not something that I'm an expert in, but I, as I say, look forward to going back and seeing some of today's earlier presentations to learn more about that. So again, these are just two pieces of my dissertation. The part that I like the most is the integration with speech chapter. It's the last chapter on beat rhyming, where I have I do an analysis of a beatboxer who beatboxes and sings at the same time. And I think there's a very interesting finding that comes out of that. And if you'd like to read about that, I'd be happy to send my dissertation to you. You can email me at readblaylock@gmail.com. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Sorry, thank you so much. I suggest, Lisa, if you want to join, and Hélène for the last discussion. So are there any questions to read about this presentation? There was many brand new information here for us.
Not new for me, because I assisted his wonderful PhD defense. So congratulations, Reed.
Well, thank you.
That was awesome. Well, I have a question if nobody has.
Go on.
Reed, a question for you about phonological harmony. In speech, do you know over how many segments phonological harmony spreads, and how, if you have you looked into over how many segments it spreads in beatboxing?
This is a great question. I don't know the answer to either question. In speech, I know people have been talking a lot recently about phonology counting to 3 or something. As far as I know, there's no time limit for in the articulatory studies of harmony. You might find, say, a retroflex tongue body posture in speech, and it might persist for several segments as it goes from, say, one coronal stop to another a few segments down. So I don't know if there's a limit. I know that harmony tends to die out after a while in a word, but I don't know what the limits exactly are. It may be it might not be cognitive so much as it might just be the tongue decides it's done for no particular reason. It might be a little bit more random. In beatboxing, it's a trickier question because there's so much repetition from measure to measure, or every 2 measures or so. You, at least in my data set, find repetition of the same sounds. And so you often find, as in the Spitznare example I gave earlier, a Spitznare every measure, or a click roll every 2 measures. And so it's difficult to say for sure how far the harmony is spreading in each direction when the same sound keeps showing up and making more harmony happen.
So in speech, it is not a non-off event. It's like it fades.
That's my understanding. We usually, when we write it down, think of it as being on and off because that's how letters work. But I think I don't know for sure. As somebody who's clever or knows more than I do can say for sure. But I think it does fade.
I have a question. During this Beatbox Day, we discussed a lot about 2 aspects, and I really would like your point of view on it. First is the notion of boxeme, as an analogy of phoneme, or describing this category of sounds that several beatboxers will spontaneously produce. What do you think about this terminology? Do you agree with this, or do you have arguments against it?
I disagree. I love the word. I love the word boxeme. And I only disagree because I think it's better suited as an analogy to morpheme than to phoneme. A beatboxing sound is meaningful. And if we think of a beatboxing sound as a phonological segment, then the segment and the meaning are one and the same. But that doesn't have to be true. So in the framework that I work in articulatory phonology, the fundamental units aren't segments or features, but they're gestures. And if we think of boxeme as being composed of gestures, then we can think of a morphological unit, a unit of meaning, being composed of a set of reusable gestures that are meaningless. And I, so far, am not sure if there's anything that a boxeme gets us by being a phoneme that's different than what it would get us from it being a morpheme. But the fact that a beatboxing sound seems to be a unit of meaning, I think, is a very important aspect of its nature.
The second question was about the way we describe the beatboxing sounds. We all started with the international phonetical alphabet, the API, IPA. And so I was, in your way of looking at it, you kind of found a new way of describing the sound, new categories, and maybe it's a step forward to a new way of description, of phonetical description of this kind of sound, especially the way you propose. So, do you believe that we could reinvent a way to describe in an articulatory way, it seems to me, the beatboxing sound, with a vocabulary, with a terminology that will be shared to all of us?
Maybe. For fun, in my dissertation, I tried to do, of all the different sounds we have, an IPA transcription of each of them. And in some cases, it seemed very difficult or very hard, because the nature of the sounds, some of the beatboxing sounds they require a temporal representation almost. So the kick snare, for example, I'm sorry, the K snare, it has its closure and its release, and in some cases, like for my beatboxer, it has both a laryngeal action and a pulmonic action. And you can't, in the IPA, combine those two airstreams together into one type of notation. It's just not possible. And maybe we could make up a symbol for it, but it's very complicated to come up with all these diacritics and to put all these different pieces in, especially when the beatboxing sounds can be very complex and require combinations of things that we don't find in speech. I certainly wouldn't want to replace the phonetic alphabet or other beatbox notation with a more gestural or other kind of notation, but I think there's important value to be had to describing the sounds from their actual movements as we think about them, to see what's actually going on with them, and that it's bigger, it takes up more space on the page, but in some cases it may be very revealing.
Well, thank you so much. There's a question from Sten Ternström in the room.
Well, thank you, Reid, and nice work. Actually, on this issue of notation, I thought it was rather striking that your solution is rather similar to the one of Peter Helgason, having the attributes and a timeline. And once you have that, you can slice the timeline and notate those attributes as a sequence of symbols, which I didn't talk about, but that's how it can be made searchable. But I don't know if you made that step, but I saw your timeline and it struck the similarity, I think, was striking. So
we haven't done that kind of thing yet. And the sort of the one of the big, how do I say this? It's tricky to do that kind of thing because, of course, there is overlap between different boxemes, whatever you think of a boxeme being. And so between the different segments or segment-sized things, the movements overlap. They certainly do in speech, where we have all these kind of the nasalization example in English. And so doing a segmentation is actually very challenging because you can't only get one sound or the other sound. You often end up with two sounds in one chunk. In beatboxing, I think we've been finding that the sounds are a little bit more separate often, but in the case of what I've been calling harmony or just in a regular humming beatboxing pattern, there is a lot of temporal overlap. And for annotation purposes and for transcription purposes, I think it's very helpful to lay out the articulations and to chunk them up. But I think it might be maybe almost misleading because say I'm right, which I think is an awful lot to say, and say that the tongue body closure from a Spitznare is extending across many other beatboxing sounds. If you were to segment it up, as I think you're saying, then if you look at one kick drum and then another kick drum, you might call them both humming kicks, but actually they would both be humming kicks and Spitznares at the same time, even though the Spitznare hasn't been made yet, because the tongue body articulation would be coming from the Spitznare. So it's it becomes suddenly a theoretical challenge to decide how to label things when you segment them, if you're laying them out in this timeline first.
No, well, point taken. I mean, the work we were doing was only looking at one sound at a time. And of course, if you're doing a sort of a 3-part time multiplexed rendition, then you would need some additional level of description for that.
It's really challenging for speech, and it's even more challenging for beatboxing because there's so many sounds that as far as I know, we haven't yet agreed on annotation for, even with the symbol. So it's all very exciting and new.
There's another question in the room. Yeah, I have another question, Reid, about this notion of phonological harmony. In speech, when there is harmony or co-articulation, the listeners take that into account. So for instance, in an American English listener will say that they heard per, a, and n, but they definitely won't say that they heard nasalization inside the vowel, because they sort of take harmony, take co-articulation into account. Do you think there's a similar thing in beatbox, and that expert listeners of beatbox will do the same and account for harmony?
What a wonderful question. I think it depends on the beatboxer, just like a phonetician or other speech scientist. Once your ear has been trained and you've had a lot of awareness brought to beatboxing sound production, you might be more able to identify these differences or not to compensate for the co-articulation in your perception. And since beatboxers are learning beatboxing later than childhood often, as far as I know, and since beatboxers are training their ears and their mouths, it's possible that beatboxers will be better at perceptually recognizing these differences that in language we might not recognize. I will say that one of the things that put me onto this path in the first place was that the beatboxing colleague I worked with at first, Nimisha Patil, she once performed a humming beatboxing pattern for me. And I was paying attention to whether she was using humming kicks or power kicks. And she used exclusively humming kicks in her pattern because it was a humming beatboxing pattern. And then I asked her what beatboxing sound she was making for her kick drums, and she said that they were power kicks. So at least some of the time, it seems that beatboxers might not distinguish between the two while they're performing. And so I think that might be the same for the perceptual case you just described.
Yeah. Another question. Yes, Claudio. Claudio Smile.
Okay, thank you for the beautiful presentation. I want to turn back to the question of the linguistic nature of beatbox or not. In all these speeches that we listened to in this day and during the presentation of Annalisa and the following discussion, I didn't listen to an argument that, in my opinion, contribute to go against, to separate the true character of beatbox from language, and it is the absence, in my opinion, of a fundamental unit of language communication, which is the syllable. I find very difficult to imagine a beatbox sound and assimilating to the nature of a syllable. I remember that the Raymond Kent, speaking of babbling, once told that the babbling is the first linguistic behavior during the ontogenetic evolution, because it is the first appearance of a unit which can be considered similar to language from an informational point of view and also from an articulatory point of view. And these characteristics and the absence of similarity to syllable for me is due to the absence of articulation during the consonant produced in instances in occurrence of beatbox sound with a vowel, a proper vowel. I can find evidence of a true vowel okay, I stop here. Okay.
This is the question of a beatboxing syllable is oh, these are also wonderful questions. This is something that I almost put into my dissertation and then stopped halfway through. But so you were describing a syllable as having a co-articulation between a consonant and a vowel, but of course, well, I think you were saying that you have examples of true vowels in beatboxing. but in general, I think we don't find vowels often in beatboxing, and so there's no chance or few chances to find that kind of consonant-like sound, vowel-like sound overlap. Sometimes in my framework, we think about syllabification as not co-articulation or temporal overlap, but as the coordination of the beginnings of the movements of the sound. Are they stable together? Are they close together in time? And there are some other things to look at when you have consonant clusters, say at the beginning. There are regular patterns that we expect that vary from language to language, but that all sort of are hallmarks of syllable structure in the coordination of the onset of movement, often of the sound. And in beatboxing, we have the only example I've been able to come up with so far for this is any case where you have a kick drum followed by some kind of trill. So it might be a kick drum and a lip roll, or a tongue roll, or a click roll, or often a roll, sometimes a bass sound. But in many cases, you'll get, I can't do them well myself, but you'll get the kick drum first, and then the trill afterward, or something. And they seem, to my ear, to be coordinated to the same beat. So maybe they're both aligned to the first metrical beat of an utterance. And if they're aligned to the same beat, that makes me think that maybe they're being coordinated together. The kick drum has to come first, the trill has to come second. That's just how it works for one reason or another. But they're together in time because of the musical meter, and the coordination looks fairly regular. The kick drum happens very quickly before whatever the trill is going to be, and I imagine there's some details to work out in terms of the relative timing depending on where the trill is being made. But that seems to me like what we might think of as a beatboxing syllable. It's not happening all the time. It's not a required type of coordinative unit for beatboxing in the way that syllables are often required all the time for speech. But I think if I would say that, and I think I would, I'd like to say that the gestures or whatever the fundamental units of beatboxing and speech are related somehow. I think the coordinative patterns that include creating syllables are also related.
Yes, thank you. I intend your position, and you are perfectly right when you say that even in beatboxing, there are, from the point of view of articulation, more than one unit which is articulated with another. But even in the language, you are languages where syllables are not represented by the union of a consonant and a vowel, but often consonant is followed by a sonorant, a trill, like Trostet or Trieste in Slovenic language. But the point is not this. For me, the combinatorial possibilities offered by the union of a consonant plus a vowel is more fruitful, more productive than the combination of a consonant of as the consonants in the beatboxing repertoire, with a trill, with a sonorant, because you cannot produce very as many type of syllables like you find in language. Vowels are easily distinctive by our constitution, so you can effort on the presence of a vowel more than a trill or very kind of sonorants to build words adding more a number of syllables. I don't know if I am successful for explaining
I think so.
My opinion.
Your point is, I think your point is well taken. This is defining a syllable is tricky even in language, and figuring out, for me, figuring out how beatboxing and speech may be related will depend in this case on how we choose to define a syllable or what's important out of the inventory of speech and beatboxing. And this is a very big question to begin asking.
We have our last question, and then we will have to conclude. So Stan, the last word is for you.
Thank you for this interesting point. I mean, I would have guessed that as a beatboxer, I would strive to avoid co-articulation as much as possible to keep to help the listener separate these streams of information. You don't want them to be mixed up. You don't want them to be co-articulated, really. So, which makes it all the harder, of course. But
But I think articulation is mandatory, in fact. Co-articulation is mandatory in any case.
well, there's the physical constraint.
Yes, because of the physical constraints. So,
but part of the wow factor is trying to defy that.
yeah, and as Lisa said, we did observe co-articulation patterns on the data.
Yeah.
And if some people think that a lot of the phonological patterns we find in language began with the physical co-articulation that just has to occur. So perhaps we'll find in the next 20 years of beatboxing that we evolve from trying to separate all the sounds to regularizing some kinds of co-articulation.
Beatbox evolution. Yeah. It's evolution. So thank you so much to all of you. Thank you again, Reid, for joining us from so far away. And congratulations, by the way, for your success dissertation. Congratulations to Lisa as well. Very soon to Alexis. Je te mets pas la pression. Je vais rebasculer en français. Donc, merci à tous vraiment pour avoir participé à cette journée. On est ravis. Moi, je trouve qu'on en a pris plein la figure, en fait. C'est beaucoup d'informations à digérer jusqu'à la prochaine édition du Beatbox Day 2023. J'espère que ce que j'espère à travers ça, c'est que cette dynamique qu'on lance aujourd'hui, elle perdure et que de plus en plus de personnes s'intéressent à cette question du beatbox à travers leur propre prisme. Donc, c'était une journée ouverte à toutes les formes de pratique, à toutes les relectures par rapport aux expertises de chacun. Et j'espère vraiment que ceux qui sont comme nous passionnés par cet art vocal no limits, soient des petits acteurs aussi du développement des connaissances qu'on peut avoir, non seulement en sciences, de son évolution dans les pratiques artistiques, de son enseignement, de la pédagogie du beatbox, de son utilisation clinique et puis de son usage pour les technologies nouvelles, pour la reconnaissance automatique. Voilà, donc est-ce que vous voulez rajouter quelque chose, co-organisatrice de la journée? Très bien. Merci à tous et à toutes. Merci à tous et rendez-vous en 2023. C'est le moment de vous saluer tous qui êtes en ligne sur le Zoom et sur la chaîne YouTube. Et puis, bonne soirée.